Hi everyone, I'm Ritika. I'm your host for today's episode of Green Frontier Capital's Brewed for Change. Green Frontier Capital is one of India's leading climate tech focused venture capital funds. I am extremely happy to have with me here today Mr. Thomas Kerr, who is the lead climate specialist for South Asia at the World Bank Group. I'd like to start by asking you to introduce yourself, Mr. Kerr, and maybe give us a little bit of a background to your professional life and how your expertise in climate has evolved over the last few years.
Yeah, thank you, Ritika. Really good to be with you. So I have been working in climate change a little over 30 years, believe it or not. I started my career in Washington at the Environmental Protection Agency. I'm a lawyer by training, and I was maybe one of the first lawyers that decided that climate change was an important enough topic that we had to have climate change lawyers. So I studied climate change law. And it was really interesting because at that time, EPA did not have the regulatory authority to sort of regulate greenhouse gases, but we did have the authority to approach businesses and say, hey, we have a business idea for you that might reduce emissions and make you money. Very interesting, innovative programs at the time. And we created things like, I don't know if you've heard of Energy Star, which is a label that now is on a lot of computers and copiers and equipment around the world, which helps consumers to identify energy efficient equipment. But I actually, to believe it or not, I started working on landfill methane, which is, methane is created when waste goes into landfills, and it's a very potent greenhouse gas. But interestingly enough, it's also a fuel source, and you can use it to generate power or power factories, and it's very clean. And so part of my first job was to go tramp around landfills and to, help people understand that this is a new emerging renewable energy opportunity. And over the years, I've worked on many different solutions from methane and landfills to renewable energy to industrial energy efficiency, and then getting broader to agriculture, climate smart agriculture. And so I've seen, a lot of these solutions in my lifetime and working here really come in the market. It's been a really dynamic space, in terms of market penetration. And so it's been a very interesting ride. I think the past few years, as you mentioned, I've now moved and I'm in charge of climate change in South Asia for the World Bank. And there I really had to learn much more about the sort of resilience side of things, because previously it was, reducing emissions, super important. There's a lot of opportunity. On the resilience side, there's a huge amount of human impact from climate change. And I particularly see that in India and Bangladesh and Pakistan, many of the countries in South Asia. And so it's a different set of tools and solutions around building resilience of infrastructure, helping farmers to adapt to heat and things like that.
So since you mentioned resilience, what are some of the specific risks and vulnerabilities that stand out for you specifically in South Asia?
Yeah, so I just touched on a few of them. I mean, really what strikes me a lot, coming from Washington, which is very hot in the summer, is how hot it's getting in South Asia. I know all of you located in the region know this for a fact, but it just every heat season in the early spring, April, May, around that time frame, it's just devastating heat for farmers in particular, but also people like construction workers in big cities. There's really no way to cool off, and so that's having a direct impact on economic productivity. You can't work during the heat of the day. You have impact on the crops that are not ready to kind of adapt to this heat. But then so there's many facets of heat, and there's a lot of solutions around providing thermal comfort and cooling, but that's a key need. Obviously, coastal storms, typhoons, and cyclones are a huge area for the region. And then when you mix it in with the monsoons and sort of the melting glaciers, you get things like what happened in Pakistan a few years back with these massive floods. And so, that has, urban flooding, you have agricultural fields flooding. Then you have even the after effects of things like mosquitoes and dengue coming up because, people are living with a lot of water. So it's very complicated there. So, storms have that kind of knock-off effect as well. And then I would say too that I think getting into the glacial part, we work a lot in South Asia on hydropower, upstream, a lot of hydropower goes from Nepal and Bhutan into India and other countries. And those hydropower dams are at risks now because you have more landslides happening and you have silt coming in from rapidly melting snow. And that's something they didn't anticipate when they built these dams. And so that's something else we're having to work on.
Right, absolutely. And of course, I'm sitting here in New Delhi today, and it's September, and it's increasingly hotter by the day. We've also seen a lot of cyclones and floods in India this year as well. So specifically on that, do you see that any of the models have been able to accurately capture these issues, these risks? And going forward, do you see modeling as perhaps an exercise to a certain extent, predict what is going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely the models are getting much better. The data is much better. You have AI and machine learning that's improving. So you get data and then you can extrapolate from one region to the next. So it definitely is getting much better. And so a lot of times now when it's not an abstract concept when we come and we do a modeling exercise and we say, well, here is your agricultural productivity right now. Then if you overlay the heat and the sort of flooding and drought that we expect in your agricultural, here's what your impact might be. We can say that with a lot more confidence, but it's still, it's not perfect, right? It's something that still continues to evolve and to improve. But it is allowing us to kind of at least bound the risks and sort of, at a really extreme scenario, here's what you might be looking at, or if a lesser scenario. And so then that gives governments and businesses at least a smaller kind of window to plan and think about their investments. How do you, what are the priorities for infrastructure? As one example, I worked in Nepal quite a bit, and I mentioned this, these landslides. I found out, didn't realize that because of its sort of landlocked status, I think 90% of traffic, all goods and services are going on roads. There's no trains or waterways. And when a landslide stops a major road, the entire country stops. You can't go to school. You can't get products to market. And so that was, we were able to identify a few arteries that were super important to shore up resilience, because if they don't, their economy was going to be really, really hit by that.
And in terms of climate finance, where are we right now for South Asia? And what are some of the projections suggesting for the region?
Yeah, so it's, as I said before, it's, I've worked in this space for a while, and it's a rapidly growing, and it's rapidly dynamic. So, technology costs have come rapidly down for most of the clean energy solutions. So we all hear about solar and wind, but even batteries now, electric vehicles, buses, and even heavy duty vehicles are coming down. You even hear, I know India is making a lot of strides in green hydrogen, which is a new emerging technology. So it's really a dynamic space. And there's, we're getting into like the $40-50 billion a year of investment, for example, coming into India. That's probably, given India's status, it's the most studied. So we know we have much better numbers for what climate finance flows are in India versus some of the other countries in the region. I think the thing we like to focus on here, though, is there are, different pools of money, and when governments have a critical role to play, both in setting the right policies, because that creates a framework for investment and gives the private sector confidence that their money is going to give it the returns they expect and reduces risk. So that there's a key role in government policy, but governments can also play a role with their own public money, so that, they have development finance institutions, they have domestic entities, like, for example, the State Bank of India in India is one example, or NABARD, the big agricultural lending bank. They can play a role in providing, more concessional finance, which is kind of better terms to climate-friendly solutions, and we're working with them on that kind of thing. And also international climate finance can come in as well. So people like the World Bank and other development partners, there's the Green Climate Fund, there are pools of money. The main point there is that has to be used very catalytically, if you say, it's a very sort of, it helps to kind of tip the scale toward the right solutions. And I think there, what we really try to do is first look at private sector mobilization. Like, where are the areas where the private sector is closest to market viability for some of these solutions, and where can we kind of help to get those into market while we sort of build the policy and other ecosystem for the longer term solutions.
Understood. And in terms of the data for actually the scale of investment required. So you talked about the current flows into India and South Asia, but what is the requirement for the net zero targets for India and South Asia?
There are a lot of different estimates. I mean, I don't know. I won't quote you a specific number off the top of my head. I know that, I've heard, sometimes about as I said, there's a certain amount flowing today. We need about 4 or 5 times that, going forward. And I think the biggest, sort of wild card there is we have a much better sense of the investment needs for these decarbonization solutions because they've been in the market. We know the technology costs and their performance. So things like solar and wind and batteries, but it's much harder on the resilience side because that's part of obviously the climate finance pool. You need to attract finance for resilience, but that's often, an incremental amount to, like, if you're building a bridge, you need to maybe spend a little bit more to make it a little higher, so it'll avoid a flood. And that is much more challenging to sort of estimate the amounts. But I think, as I said, a lot of the studies globally have tracked finance and they say that we're about a fourth or fifth of where we need to be right now.
Understood. And of course, the World Bank has been central in mobilizing the kind of financing that is required to meet these targets. Could you walk us through the specific mechanism and instruments that the World Bank has used in South Asia?
Yes, of course. I mean, I think we have obviously investment loans that we give out to projects, but I think some interesting tools I'd like to highlight are we have a program called the Program for Results, or we call it P4R, and it ties the disbursement of the loan to specific impact outcomes, including stronger local institutions and the country has to report on these indicators. So we're kind of sure that they're meeting. It's not just about the financial flows, but it's also about delivering these development impacts. We also use something we call a development policy loan. And being a lawyer, this is one of my favorite tools because it's a kind of a big carrot to the government. It provides direct budget support for key policies or programs. And so it creates a carrot to do the right, well-designed policies. And when that policy is put in place, that sort of triggers the payment of the loan. So those are a couple tools in the toolkit. I think in addition, we use some more innovative financing. I think I mentioned concessional finance or blended finance. That's a buzzword. There's a lot of talk about the need for blended finance. In particular, what I was saying before, it's a key tool to sort of mobilize much more. So you use a very small surgical amount of public finance to then leverage much more private finance. And so, I think an example there is, a lot of times you have either smaller projects that maybe are not commercially viable by themselves. This happens, for example, like in climate smart agriculture. If you have several farms they want to convert to solar water pumps, one loan is not going to be significant ticket size for a big investor. But if we can, through concessional finance, can kind of pool those funds into a platform, that creates an opportunity for a larger investor to come in. Sometimes you also need technical assistance, like, how do you measure and report on these sorts of climate smart agriculture interventions? And that is something that we provide along with the blended finance to ensure that it's delivering these sorts of impacts. So that's another tool in the toolkit. And then finally, we have something we call results-based financing. And this is really very innovative and interesting. A lot of people think about it as carbon finance. And essentially, what it does is a lot of the things you hear when you're talking to developers is really difficult. You have a great idea, you want to find investors, but you need upfront capital to start to build the project and get started. And there's nobody willing to offer you that because it can be seen as very risky. So results-based finance sort of looks at the impact of a project in the future, and then it calculates the carbon emissions and what that might be, and then it provides a pool of upfront capital based on that amount. So one example of that I think is great that we've come out with recently is we did the world's first carbon bond, the World Bank Treasury did in Vietnam a couple of years back. And essentially, it was the same situation I was talking about. There was some schools that were using sort of fossil-based technology to do water treatment, and they wanted to replace that with solar. They calculated the emissions benefit from doing that, and then they quantified, they made a price of carbon assumption, and then they found some investors that were willing to pay that price up front. And then even there were some global banks and investors that were willing to sort of guarantee that price range because, the carbon market, the price will change over time. And so that kind of created a buffer. And so that created this upfront capital. They were able to build the projects. And so now they're actually delivering this cleaner water based on that. And so that's a really exciting project. I think it was about a $200 million project, and we hope to replicate that in many other sectors.
Incredible. I'd like to actually touch upon the last thing you mentioned here, which was on results-based financing. Since you talked about quantifying the climate impact, obviously as a climate-focused venture capital fund, that is extremely important to us as well. And we try our best to encourage our portfolio companies to also quantify their impact. So on that front, do you think that there are metrics and methodologies that can actually help quantify the climate impact of a project on a large scale?
Yes, yeah. And so I think the World Bank and the other multilateral development banks have developed a very good sort of tested now set of methodologies for calculating climate benefits of projects like this. I would start with that. I think that's a really good methodology. It can be adapted to different scenarios, but it covers all of the key mitigation and resilience solutions as well. And I think, I don't want to say it's the gold standard, but you can be sure that it's been discussed and vetted amongst the MDBs and amongst internal teams. And, the key thing is really to be able to measure and report on those outcomes. And so we identify very specific outcomes, and you have a sort of a timing in which you have to report. And we've used this for quite a few years now.
Absolutely. And I'd like to talk about something else you mentioned, which was blended finance and encouraging the private sector to come forward and take the lead on climate finance. So where do you think the private sector's participation is important? If you would maybe like to go into some specific sectors where the private sector can really take the lead. And what are some of the public-private partnership models that you've seen around?
Yeah, no, I think, as I said, it's really dynamic. Every country sort of has its own landscape of private finance in climate change. And so it's really important. There's general terms. We know solar and wind and now some e-vehicles are getting to be sort of market competitive in many, many countries. But it really does, you have to get into the specific domestic policy landscape and understand, that there's kind of the domestic banking and sort of capital markets. And that's a sort of, regardless of whether you're doing climate, it's, that's a threshold that you have to pass. But then once you get, and you get that and it's attractive, then you have to look at the specific terms of a climate investment. And there it does depend sometimes, as I mentioned before, on the policy landscape and where things stand. But I think we have done a really interesting sort of set of climate finance deep dives for India recently. And we did them. And really, because there's so much going on in India, we had to do it sector by sector. So we broke it into climate smart agriculture. We looked at urban resilience solutions. So this is wastewater treatment and waste and urban transit, things like air pollution. We looked at other transport, e-mobility, and we looked at industrial decarbonization and energy decarbonization. And then, we kind of helped really look at all the solutions providers and what they're offering. And then we looked at what the banks were offering and tried to figure out exactly, where is the spectrum of market viability for key technologies. And, in some cases, there wasn't really, it was a market play, and it was really just about educating the banks that this was an opportunity. And we're seeing some promising things there. But then in other cases, like I would say maybe climate smart agriculture is one case where the banks were saying we don't really have sort of a clarity on what the government thinks qualifies as climate resilient, and so we need a sort of methodology. And so that will require some work to develop the right policy and some partnership between public and private to make that happen. I think, as I said, every sort of sector will have its own different dynamics and different partnerships that can come up. But I think that's the kind of sort of more granular sector specific analysis that you really need to do when you're getting into trying to identify where the most promising climate finance opportunities are in a particular country.
And how do you see some of the innovative financing models being adapted to South Asia's context? So, for example, carbon pricing and green bonds. And what are some of the challenges that you see?
Yeah, I'll start with carbon pricing. I think it's a fascinating thing to watch, the evolution. With the World Bank actually just put out a statement trends of carbon markets that people kind of see as the Bible to, monitor the developments. And, I think we've gotten into, we have, 30 or $40 billion of carbon markets revenue now every year. I think we have, 60 plus jurisdictions, governments are doing carbon pricing. And the interesting part to me is that it's moved from, California and Canada and the EU to China now. And then you have, South Africa looking at it, Korea, and now India, is now, has officially announced it's developing an emissions trading scheme. So it's really become a very important way. And I think the way I always look at it is it's just it levels the playing field, right? It gives everybody the same goal. And it tells you can trade and work, amongst each other to get the most efficient way to reduce these emissions. And so it's a very attractive, sort of policy. And then what you really need to do, though, to make it viable is you have to have the right sort of regulatory infrastructure in place. You have to have a valid registry. You have to have sort of transparency for market pricing, and things like that. So the World Bank helps many, many countries around the world to put these sort of technical, infrastructure in place, if you will. And I, every private sector meeting I'm at, they're always, when you're a progressive company, you say, actually, please put a price on carbon, but we want to be part of the discussion. They want to, understand how do we help to shape that, because they see the writing on the wall. They see the impacts of climate change and they want to mitigate emissions. And so there's a lot of support for carbon markets. Then switching to green bonds, I think they have been a huge success story on climate finance over the past couple of decades. I mean, the World Bank was the first issuer. I think the latest statistics, it's getting almost $600 billion, market size. And you're starting to see it started with the groups like the World Bank or multilateral institutions issuing bonds because they were trusted institutions. But then it's really expanded to, national governments, to local governments, to corporations. We even saw the first rhino bond in Africa, recently. So there's a lot of innovation there. Really what these do is there's targeted environmental outcomes. And there is a methodology that, the key part of that, the kind of the secret sauce of a green bond is that you have a very good impact measurement and reporting scheme. So people are confident you're going to deliver on that. And once you put that in place, you see a lot of market innovation happening. And I think, we do a lot of work on the technical assistance side to help educate people. How do you issue a bond? How do you report on it? Things like that. But I think it also is very exciting to see, as I say, the innovation around, it's not just green bonds anymore. You're seeing rhino bonds. You're seeing blue bonds for marine plastics. You're seeing, resilience bonds are being discussed in the resilience space. So that's a very promising area as well.
Okay, understood. And in terms of mobilizing large-scale climate finance, considering that India and South Asia are some of the most vulnerable economies, what are some of the structural and institutional barriers you see here?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we have done a series of diagnostics of countries around the world around climate and climate finance, and I think one of the key things that comes out to me is, on the resilience side in particular, is the need for capacity building and institutional structures at the state and local level, so subnational, because a lot of times the national governments have a vision, they have a commitment they've made, they're putting resources towards it, but we all know that impacts happen to communities on the ground, and so you really need to give those local first responders, the things like early warning systems and data monitoring and build their capacity, the human capacity. So that, you have people on the ground that can monitor and report and mitigate these things. And then you have, there's financing that needs to flow as well. And coordination that needs to happen. So we've been doing some work in India. There are, most states have a climate change action plan that they've now issued. And I think we've been trying to then help them to bring those to life by, okay, how does this work in your state? Like, what are the state and local, what are the local communities that need resources? How are you working with them? And then sharing amongst different states, what are the best practices in implementing these? Because I think that the institutional capacity kind of goes all the way down from the national to the local. And that's a really key need as well. I think another challenge in the region is obviously maybe not so much for India, but is sort of the debt issue, and the fiscal space for a lot of these government And so what we've been trying to do with these, we do these diagnostics, which we call a country climate and development report, or a CCDR. We've done them for 4 countries in the region. In fact, I think just today we released the Maldives CCDR. And what that tries to do is really help the country by looking first at its sort of development situation. So, where is it on the spectrum of growth? What sectors is it trying to target? What resources does it have? And where is it hoping to go? In terms of, middle income status, in terms of poverty alleviation and things like that. We then, you talked before about these models, so then we have much better models of climate impact. So then we look at the climate impact on countries and what that might do to these aspirations, and how is that going to impact their growth? If they have a large agriculture sector, obviously climate's going to impact that growth path. And as you look at that, certain risks pop up that they aren't covering so well, resilience needs and adaptation needs. But then also we found some opportunities pop up where, you could invest more in, sustainable tourism in Maldives, or you could, look at, as I mentioned, there could be much more efficient logistics and roads in Nepal. And so it really helps the country to kind of build the capacity of what are the top priorities and what needs to happen to both shore up resilience, but also to tackle some of these emissions reductions. So that's a way that the World Bank is using. It's a document that's a public document. But we also use it for our lending program. It kind of helps us to prioritize where we're going to provide support. But we share it with private sector. We share it with other development partners, and we hope that they use it as well.
So actually, my next question was going to be on how the World Bank decides to allocate funds across different regions in South Asia and what the process is. I think you touched upon that a little bit here, but would you like to elaborate on that a bit more?
Yeah, I think the CCDR is a newer tool, so it definitely is helping us. We're still kind of mapping out how it's guiding our strategy. But I think it is a very iterative process. It's a lot of stakeholder engagement with the client to understand what the government's goals are to try to achieve, but also with other stakeholders. The private sector is a key one, of course, to see where are the key needs for development and climate, and how do we kind of bring them together. It's interesting when you walk into the World Bank now, it says our dream is a world ending poverty on a livable planet. And so those are the kind of twin goals we have at the World Bank now. And these tools are really helping us to kind of balance development and climate, because they're so intertwined and they're so important to tackle at the same time. So we really try to provide that lens of all of our projects now, across all sectors, from health and education through energy, through agriculture and water and other sorts of things.
So, just a follow-up question on that, since we've talked about how South Asia is vulnerable to climate change-related disasters. There's also an associated problem of vulnerable communities. How do you think World Bank projects and other projects and other investment projects in India and in other countries in South Asia actually can balance the needs of the vulnerable communities as well as foster development?
Yeah, that's an absolutely critical thing. I think we have had a lot of success in South Asia actually on this front. So there's 2 examples I can mention. One is that in Bangladesh, coastal communities obviously are at the forefront of these cyclones, and I remember the statistics. One of my colleagues told us is in the 70s, a major storm would hit and you'd have tens of thousands of people would die. It was they didn't have any way of warning. They had no system for shelter. And it was devastating. Over the years, we built this sort of local community-led adaptation, and it's sort of a mix of what we call hard and soft infrastructure. So it has some seawalls and some, big investments that help to mitigate the impact of the storms, but a lot of it has to do with this sort of soft, which is the community education. It's building schools that are resilient, but also are, gathering places when a storm hits, and so people know where to go. But then also a key element of this is early warning systems that are much better than they used to be, and are able to really, in advance of a disaster, help people to evacuate and get out of the way of the storm. And so you've seen those tens of thousands drop to hundreds or even less in some cases, which has been a huge success. A couple of colleagues wrote a really good study about a year ago of looking back at the past 10 or 15 years of Bangladesh's leadership on coastal resilience. And we've even had other countries like in Europe asking us, hey, we'd like to see that because we can learn from Bangladesh, because it's been really innovative in a lot of ways. The second example I would give you is Nepal. there's a big forestry industry in Nepal, but interestingly, it's there's a huge indigenous element to this, and community-led forestry is a key success we've had in the past couple of years, where they have certain products that they're producing, and they have there's a highly sort of biodiverse, rich area in the south called the Terai. And there was some challenges with losing forests to encroaching development, and we provided some grants and some technical support. And really, the key part of that project was a community-led sort of engagement process that brought in the indigenous tribes, understood what they wanted to do, and helped them to also tap into carbon finance for the forests that they were saving. So it was really innovative, and that was an example of the kind of community-led sort of development that we are trying to do across a lot of World Bank projects.
Amazing. And since you've talked about regional cooperation, I won't ask about that, but I'd like to ask you to elaborate more on the international cooperation that you see for climate finance and generally towards climate action. What role do you see the World Bank and other multilateral institutions playing in facilitating this cooperation across the globe?
Yeah, I think it's a critical thing that we need to do. And I think, all these examples I've given you, it's really important. I think I don't know if you've heard, there's a US movie called Field of Dreams, and there's a famous tagline called, "If you build it, they will come." If you haven't seen it, it's a great movie, but I always like that tagline because I'm a lawyer, as I said at the beginning, and I think we've seen a lot of cases where governments have put in place policies, and after the right policies are in place, the investment starts to flow. India is a great example in the region of solar power. I used to work at the International Energy Agency, and this is like about 10 or 12 years ago. And back then, India was nowhere on the map in terms of solar. If you fast forward to today, I think they're the fourth or fifth largest solar market in the world. So how did that happen? They had a mix of carrots and sticks and policies at the national level that mandated, but also some incentives to the private sector. States came in with some support about grid access. There was a financing scheme. Of course, there's sort of the solar mission at the national level to call attention, but altogether, this created a really vibrant, attractive market for the private sector. And so they built it, and people have been coming, and you're seeing billions of dollars go into solar in India. I think what the World Bank can do, going to your question, is, we want to shine a spotlight on these solutions that have been successful, and inspire people. This can be done. Maybe it won't be exactly, if you're in Nigeria, you may not be able to completely replicate what India did, but you could learn lessons from what they did and hopefully get inspired by that. And so we actually just published a report last year that was called Reality Check, that has a series, I think, about 25 of these sorts of case studies across all sorts of sectors, just showing what had been successful implementation of climate policies, and hopefully inspiring people this can be done. And then, of course, once you get an interested client, then the World Bank is there to help. Okay, how do we actually replicate this and adapt it to your particular country?
Absolutely. And you've used the word inspired, so I think this has to be my last question to you. Who are some of the people who have inspired you in your understanding of climate, and who are some of the people who've actually made a huge difference to how you view climate change?
Yeah, well, it's funny. I would come to two leaders in the region of South Asia because, it's funny. As I said, I've been going to the COPs and the various sort of climate change talks for years, and I've interacted before with these gentlemen, but there's been inspirations to me. One is Salim Al-Haq, who was from Bangladesh. He was a negotiator, a scientist, and a leading voice around the voice of the emerging markets economies in the climate change talks, in particular around the need for adaptation and resilience, because everybody was focusing on mitigation. He really raised the point that we can't just tackle the emissions; we have to tackle communities and people on the front lines. And he was just a super big inspiration. We wrote a little blog about him last year when he passed away, but he's just led to so many conversations and really important changes in the sort of global governance on climate change that he's been a key person. And then the second one would be Ajay Mathur, who is now at the International Solar Alliance, but started his career in the Indian government, was a leader on energy efficiency, and was just a tireless. I worked with him when I was at IEA on many different energy efficiency schemes, but then he went to the Green Climate Fund. And he's just a terrific advocate for, we can do this. We need to bring in the private sector. We need to inspire people, and a positive message about that kind of, the same thing I was saying before was we can build it and they will come. And so he's been another person that I've looked to as well. I think finally would be Christiana Figueres, who was the former head of the UNFCCC. She now runs a podcast and a sort of platform. I think it's called Courage and Optimism or something like that. And I've interacted with her over the years, and she just has a tireless energy and sort of commitment to the cause, to making sure that the people pay attention to the needs, both on the opportunity side, but on the risks. And so I would encourage, if you haven't checked out her podcast, you should look that up as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Tom, for joining us today. There's a lot to take away from this conversation. I'm sure our audience will hugely benefit from whatever you've shared with us on the different topics that we've discussed today. Thank you so much, and have a great day.
Yeah, thank you, Ritika. I really appreciate being invited today, and look forward to working more in the region and advancing climate change with all of you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.